All right, so it is about 7:02, so I think we will get started now. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Alexandra, and I work with the City of Sunnyvale, and I will be moderating for tonight's program. Along with our co-sponsor, Bosqua, and our instructor, Suzanne Bontempo, I want to welcome all of you to our class. All right, so before we begin the program, I'm going to provide some guidelines for a successful participation in tonight's webinar. First, all attendees are muted by default to reduce the background noise for the presentation. We will be pausing periodically throughout the presentation to allow for questions, and we highly encourage you to ask any questions that you have. If you'd like to ask a question, you can do so in two ways. First option is to type your question into the Q&A chat box. I will then read the questions and the instructor will respond directly to it. You can also raise your hand using the raise hand feature. I will then call upon you and unmute you to ask your question. The illustration at the bottom of this slide shows you where you can use those buttons. I'd also like to note that tonight's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on Bosqua's website. Great. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about what Bosqua is and what they are offering. So Bosqua is a special district that represents the interests of 26 cities, water districts, and private water companies, all of which purchase wholesale water from the San Francisco Regional Water System. Bosqua member agencies collectively serve over 1.8 million residents and 40,000 businesses in San Mateo, Santa Clara, and Alameda counties. Bosqua's goal is to ensure a reliable supply of high quality water at a fair price for agencies and their customers. Consistent with that goal, Bosqua provides a regional water conservation program to support agencies in improving water use efficiency. The landscape education program is one element of that conservation program. Now, while we have made significant strides in water use efficiency in the past decade, there is still room for improvement. Outdoor water use represents the single largest untapped opportunity for water conservation in the Bosqua area. Outdoor water use reduction through use of water efficient plants and innovative techniques can help conserve water and ensure that future water supply needs of our communities are met. I'd like to share just a few highlights on additional water conservation programs that may be of interest to you. Valley Water has several rain barrel rebate options. You can get up to $35 for installing a rain barrel and $1 per square foot for a rain garden. Bosqua also has a newly redesigned landscape rebate program, which provides rebates to customers of participating water agencies for replacing water-intensive lawn space with water-efficient landscaping. There's also the Bosqua Be Gone rebate, which gives residents various rebates for transforming their lawns and making them more efficient. Bosqua also has the I Heart Gray Water program, which gives residents up to $200 in rebates for connecting a washing machine to a gray water irrigation system. Another new addition for Bosqua is their Smart Controller program, which provides instant rebates and heavily discounted pricing on the purchase of the Ratio 3 irrigation controller. This controller can be operated on your smartphone and can be purchased for $100 plus tax through this program by customers of participating water agencies. For more information to find out which programs are available in your area, visit bayareaconservation.org. The City of Sunnyvale also has some water saving rebates to offer you. We offer $1 per square foot of rebates for replacing your lawns and plants that require a lot of water with drought tolerant plants or permeable hardscape. We also offer up to $200 in rebates for properties that connect a clothes washer to a gray water irrigation system. You can learn more about this at sunnyvale.ca.gov/savewater. Furthermore, if you're looking for compost, stop by our city's Smart Station Monday through Sunday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. for compost and mulch. Remember to bring your own shovel and container. Valley Water also supports sustainable landscapes. They have various rebates for you, including $1 to $2 rebates per square foot. For more information on that, visit watersavings.org. Other resources can be found at southbaygreengardens.org, watersavings.org, and by emailing waterwise@valleywater.org. And all of these links will be available to you through an email after the webinar. You can also sign up for Valley Water's e-newsletter to learn more and keep up to date with Santa Clara Valley Water District. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we invite you to stay tuned for our upcoming webinar classes this spring. You can view the full schedule and register at bayareaconservation.org. Finally, if you're looking for additional resources on water efficient landscaping, please visit the bayareagardening.org WaterWise Gardening website. This site supports residents in water efficient landscape renovations and management. Resources include gallery of gardens with plants identified, plant selection tool, and watering calculator. To let us jump right into our main program, I'd be happy to take any questions on rebate programs in the Q&A chat option. If you type your question, I will respond to you directly. Now I am pleased to introduce our instructor, Suzanne Bontempo. We will be switching slides here in a moment and starting the presentation. Wonderful. Thanks, Suzanne. So tonight we will be talking about sustainable water-wise edible gardens. Our instructor is Suzanne Bontempo, and she is the owner of Plant Harmony. Awesome. So we thought we'd get started with a few questions in which you can feel free to respond to in the chat or Q&A option. And the first question that we'd like to ask all of you tonight is, are you currently growing food? And if so, for how long? You can answer A, just started this year, B, for 1 to 3 years now, or C, 4 or more years. So whatever you've been doing, feel free to drop that in the chat or the Q&A box, and it'll give us a little information on our audience tonight. Great. And then the second question that we'd like to ask is, how are you currently watering your garden? A, by hand with the hose, B, a drip irrigation system, C, a sprinkler system, or D, from rainwater catchment tank, gray water system. All right.
This is awesome. I love it. It really helps me understand where everybody is at. So when we talk about growing our water-wise edible food garden, this is fantastic. I love it. And just as a side note for all of you, please take advantage of that rain barrel rebate. 1 inch of rain over 1,000 square foot roof, you can capture over 600 gallons of water. So now that we have changing weather patterns and habits, and we seem to get a lot of rain all at once and less frequent than before, it is so important and valuable to capture as much rain as possible, keep it on site as our insurance to water our gardens through the dry months. Gray water systems, laundry to landscape, are also excellent ways to water established fruit trees, shrubs, vines, anything that's going to be above ground food crops, and also ornamentals. All right. So with that, let's get started. And yes, please go ahead and put any of your questions that you have in the Q&A, and we will address those. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go through slides for about 45 minutes, and then I'll leave I will pause for questions throughout because normally I wait till the end, but since Alexandra had mentioned we will pause, I will pause. What we're going to learn this evening is setting our food gardens up for success, how to do that, how to plant food gardens. There are some tips and tricks that you might not be aware of for some of you that are newer to growing food. And then I'm going to dive into how to water efficiently and effectively, because that is, I find to be the one thing that seems to be the most mysterious to the average gardener. And then the benefits of planting cover crops and also crop rotation, and I'll explain why. And then I'm also going to provide some additional resources. So let's get started by setting our water-wise garden up for success. So the first thing I always like to mention, though it might seem very obvious, is really understanding your sun exposure. And the sun exposure does change year to year depending on any trees that might be in the neighbor's garden or on your property that have grown. I'm noticing that right now, that my roses are actually getting less sun than they did because the trees have grown more. But full sun is going to be 6 or more hours of direct sunlight. And that's going to be really important to understand. So it's 6 hours or more of direct sunlight. Part sun, part shade is going to be 3 to 6 hours of direct sunlight, but preferably in the morning. So when we're looking at afternoon sun, that's typically hotter sun. So we want to be mindful of when we do get part sun, what time of the day is that direct sun, and be aware of that. Dappled sun, of course, is going to be filtered sunlight all day, and shade is going to be no direct sunlight. And then something I just like to point out is if you are planting, or if you have plants up against the side of a house or a garage or a fence, understand if they're south facing, that could be a very hot location. So just be mindful of, though you might have full sun or you might have, part sun, part shade, if it's up against a structure, it could be, really retaining that heat, which is something we're going to want to pay attention to. But then we're going to find a location. So we've got some options. Some of the common options that we are familiar with is planting straight into the ground, planting in pots and containers, on a patio, on a deck, or around the garden, or planting in raised beds. So planting in the ground, I just wanted to share the benefits are that it's going to be a very inexpensive option. We have that ground, we've got that space, we've got more space, or, the space is very flexible because, there's no real restrictions to where we can or can't plant unless there's, hardscape in the area. And it's not permanent. We can always be moving, planting beds around, so to speak. But the concerns would be is that we're working with our existing soil. So in some parts of the Bay Area, I know maybe planting in the existing soil isn't advised. So if you are concerned about the quality of your soil, or if there's any harmful like minerals or toxins, you can always get your soil tested. I'm sure that your soil is fine. But also, there's areas of the Bay Area that the soil is hard packed clay, and we don't really want to spend all that time amending it. So that's just something to be concerned with. Also, gophers have a lot of access to our plants when we're planting straight in the ground without any type of exclusion from them. When we're planting straight in the ground, we do have to bend down to work a little bit more, and maybe that's not always easy for us. And when we plant in the ground, believe it or not, it does use more water. In a raised bed, the benefit is that we can line that raised bed with gopher wire or 1/2-inch hardware cloth. We can also control the soil that we are using and add it to that raised bed. And believe it or not, when we plant in a raised bed, we are actually saving water. We are using less water because we're really targeting a water to a limited area. And that's really cool. Some of the concerns is the cost of the materials. We have now limited the growing space, and it's somewhat permanent. So just some things to keep in mind. And then planting in a container. Now, of course, we want to make sure that there are drainage holes in that container. If it is something that doesn't have drainage holes, we want to drill drainage holes in, multiple drainage holes that are about 1/4 inch. maybe up to 1/2 inch. But the benefits are it's great for small spaces. It's definitely more mobile. There's no gopher access. You, again, are controlling the soil and it uses less water. Something just to keep in mind is when we do have our space that we want to plant or grow food, we also want to consider some very realistic pest prevention tips. So for many of us, we're used to a lot of urban pests such as raccoons and squirrels, deer, birds, rats, cats, dogs, even people, chickens or goats, maybe in some more rural areas, can be a problem. So this is just what I like to say is the new norm when it comes to pest prevention in our gardens. Okay, these are just some really awesome pictures of exclusion structures that can be as small as an exclusion basket that fits over a raised bed, or as large as a walk-in, screened in, so to speak, greenhouse. Although it's not a greenhouse, it's just a screened in house, which is my dream. I can't wait. And then as the picture on the lower left is just really a netted structure. This would be, it's something temporary that can be, that net can be removed, but it will really prevent a lot of critters from accessing it. And I just want to share that from there, we really want to focus on the soil. Soil should not be an afterthought, and we're going to build healthy soil with compost. Our goal is to add about 5% organic matter to our soil in the form of compost. When we do that, we're improving the soil structure. So if you've got clay, you're improving it. If you've got sandy soil, you're improving it. And anything in between. Compost is a win-win. So take advantage of that free compost that you can get. What happens is when we amend that our soil with compost or integrate compost into our soil, we're increasing that water holding capacity. Okay, so we're making our soil more like a sponge. And even the clay soil, we're actually adding more air pockets and really allowing the aggregate of that structure to open up. So that's why I say it's a win-win. We're going to increase the plant roots ability to get water and nutrients when we're able to add compost. And also that compost is going to filter out any pollutants from runoff. We want to build healthy soil with compost by amending that soil with the compost at planting. So when I'm about to plant a plant, I'm going to amend that soil in my planting hole with compost with my existing soil. And for plants that are already growing, that are already established or already planted, I'm going to top dress and or side dress around the root zone with a nice layer, 1 or 2 inches of compost around that root zone underneath the layer of mulch if I am going to use a wood chip mulch. This compost will then integrate on its own and go where it needs to get to. And the reason why we want to work with compost and why compost is so amazing is because we're adding beneficial bacteria and fungi to that soil. And when we can add that beautiful organic material, we're able to integrate that beneficial bacteria and fungi into our existing soil, which is going to store nutrients and break down toxins and pollutants, but then also hold the soil together in a real natural way that's going to allow for root systems to expand out wide and deeper. And that's really what we want to get to, okay? And if we need to purchase soil, this question comes up a lot. So when we go to the store, there's a lot of different names and it gets a little confusing. So when we're planting in raised beds, we're going to use products that might say planting mix or raised bed soil. If we're planting straight in the ground, then we can use planting compost or soil amendment or organic compost, soil conditioner, things like that. And then if it's for pots and containers, we're going to be working with potting soil or container mix. And if you ever have a question, feel free to ask an associate, but then also flip those bags over and you can read the ingredients and the appropriate usage for that material. So now we're going to talk about which plants to grow. I personally love growing heirloom vegetables. And right now, heirlooms are really popular and very available. So we can go to our local garden centers and find a lot of heirloom varieties, as well as cell packed starts or in the form of seeds. And heirlooms are coming from other Mediterranean regions around the globe, which are very similar to our climate. So they're going to be ideal and very climate appropriate for our summer dry California. And they're also going to, they are typically more drought tolerant. They typically have roots that are deep divers. So they're going to actually require less water once they become more established. And then we have some choices between annual food crops, which are food crops that just have one season of a cycle. So plants like chard or kale, lettuce, tomatoes, peppers. Now, some of you might say, oh, I get my tomatoes or my peppers to actually overwinter, or I notice my chard overwinters, but it might just last another year before it goes to seed. That's fair. In some areas where we get harder frosts, then we will notice that these plants will act more like an annual food crop. Then we have perennial food crops. Now, the perennial food crops are actually going to be much more water wise. They do require less water once established, and they will actually require less care over time. These are going to be permanent crops. So when I start talking about crop rotation, I'm not referring to these. Okay, I'm going to be referring to those annual food crops. But perennial food crops are going to be plants like scarlet runner beans, which is a really fun bean to grow because it is a perennial. It has these bright purple seeds at the inside when we open up those beans. We've got artichokes and asparagus, tree collards, which is really more similar to like kale. Rhubarb, berries, sorrel, bunching onions, chives, and so many more. Okay, there's a lot of wonderful perennial crops out there. And then another way to grow more food that's going to be water wise are taking advantage of fruit trees, vines, and berries. And again, because these are going to be established plants, they're able to require less water once established. Okay, so again, the annual food crops will require more water through their growing season. Of course, the summer squash like zucchini, tomatoes, maybe even cucumbers, vegetable crops, those annual vegetable crops that have deeper root systems. Once they start growing, we will not need to water them as frequently, but the perennial and the trees, shrubs, and vines will definitely require less water once established. And then something I just want to share is we want to avoid space hogs. These space hogs, such as broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower, some of my favorite vegetables to eat. So I kind of hate I don't want to give them a bad rap, but these are best to grow during the cold, cooler months, also during the rainy season when we don't have to use our irrigation as often. But understand they take a lot of energy and a lot of time to produce the food. So they take a lot of space. And because of that, we are only getting maybe one vegetable, so one cauliflower head, whereas if we had planted lettuce or radishes or cucumbers, we would have gotten a lot more food, a higher yield per square foot, so to speak. And then the Master Gardener program of Santa Clara County has this awesome planting chart. So if you're not familiar with it, I just want to introduce this to you. I believe Alexandra is going to put the link in the chat, if not now at the end of the program. And I just want you to see, for those of you that are newer to growing food, or you really like to expand the types of food crops that you're growing, this is a really great start and a great guide for you to use when we're looking at timing of crops. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment and ask if there's any questions that I can answer.
Yeah, so there's a few questions we have here. So one of the questions that we have is there gray water program for kitchen sink water?
So I believe kitchen sink is considered black water in some counties. I'm not 100%, just because it has a lot of bacteria from the nature of the sink, just a lot of food and we're cleaning and stuff like that. I'm not 100%, but if you go onto the link for the gray water rebate, it will outline what that rebate is for. And I believe it's specifically laundry to landscape, which is very easy. It's a very easy way to get that, to reuse that water, to get it out to your garden. The only caveat, there's a couple caveats, is that the garden has to be at or below the grade of your washing machine, and that you're going to change the type of laundry detergent you use to be sodium and boron free. You can get a lot of information on graywater.org as well. Graywater Action they're the folks that wrote the code for gray water and for the state of California. And they've partnered with a lot of the municipalities to provide these gray water rebates.
Great. Thank you so much. That's great information to know. Awesome. So we have two other questions. So another one is, do you need to use soil each year if planting veggies in pots? Oh, new soil each year.
Well, that depends. So we're going to talk a little bit about crop rotation in a moment. And if you're rotating your crops, then no, you won't need to. We will also be talking about fertilizing and feeding your food crops, which I highly recommend. And that will also help, but you won't need to. However, it will be nice just to add some compost to that soil each and every year. You won't need to replace all of that potting soil, but by just adding a couple little potfuls of soil, about 5%, as I mentioned before, will definitely give that soil a little bit more of a boost.
Great, thank you. And then it looks like we have a raised hand here. Valerie, I'm going to unmute you if you have a question here. Thanks.
Hi, Valerie.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. I didn't know I had my hand raised.
Did you have a question for us?
I could ask the question of, once you get this barrel or your rainwater, how do you get the water out of the barrel? Where do you get the pressure to make it come out to water your garden?
Great question, Valerie. So a couple things. One, if the barrels are small enough, like the 55-gallon barrel, you can have them actually elevated. So I actually have mine elevated on some cinder blocks, so it'll be gravity fed. If you have something larger, or if you're in an area that's flat, because at some point that water pressure, that gravity will slow down and you won't really be able to get that water out, you'll have to employ a pump. And they do make pumps for larger, like rains barrel cisterns, things like that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Wonderful. So that looks like all the questions we have for now.
Okay,
I'll let you know if any other come up.
Okay, awesome. So then the next thing I wanted to talk about was when we can buy when we buy our plants, buy our vegetables, our food crops, we get these tags, give us a lot of information, as well as the seed pack. So regardless if we're buying a plant or a seed pack, there's a lot of information on these tags that can tell us what the sun exposure is, what kind of spacing, if it's a cool season or a warm season. Cool season meaning the cooler months of the year, warm season means the warmer months of the year. And then also how many days to harvest. So that's what is circled here, where we have 65 days to harvest, and that's from seed germination. And then from there, we can decide, are we going to plant seeds, or are we going to start the seeds in these little grow pots, or are we going to direct seed in the soil? Or do we want to buy some starts? Are we going to go to the local garden center and get the starts? These are going to be all ready to go. We can plant them right in the ground. We won't have to thin them, and we won't have too many. So that's something that's a benefit. And then you can also plant more varieties, whereas seeds, when you have a packet of seeds, that's the variety that you have. And then sometimes when you get a cell pack, you'll have lots of plants per cell. And this is intended to be very delicate, use a very delicate effort to divide them, to separate them, and to space them out and plant them. So oftentimes you'll get a 6-pack of lettuce, as in this picture, and you can have 36 plants in there, which I've had that experience many times. And so you definitely get a lot of bang for your buck, and that's a lot. So that's just something to keep in mind. Is this going to be a benefit to, can we eat all of these plants? I sure hope so. They're delicious. And then when we buy a plant in a container, we're going to take this tool again, and this tool is going to help us score and loosen up those root systems. So we want to loosen up those root systems so we can encourage them to start growing out and down. And then when we plant, we want to plant in clusters, like on a diamond grid or a hex pattern. And this is really what that looks like. And the reason why is because what happens is, as these plants grow, regardless of, of course, this is all leafy greens. There's some carrots in there as well, but we're shading, these leafy greens are now shading the soil, and it's keeping those root zones cooler. And it's also reducing water evaporation. So we're able to use less water. And then as I harvest, I'm going to be thinning these plants. So I'll be harvesting almost like every 3rd plant or so that it allows more room for the existing plants to continue to grow. It's a really great way to get a lot of plants in a small space. And then we also want to keep in mind that when we plant, so for fast growing crops such as lettuce or radishes, or basil, we want to plant in these successions so that we can have food through the coming months. So it could even be green beans, for instance, or something that isn't that we want to have a longer harvest. So let's say the plants, we have the maturity of the plant when we're going to start to be harvesting the food, let's say, is in 60 days. And in 60 days, we are going to harvest all that food, and maybe we'll be harvesting over a couple of weeks. But let's say we want that to go all the way into, the fall. So about every 2 weeks, we're going to be planting a couple more seeds or a couple more plants of that same variety so that we can extend our harvest time. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I just kind of got a little clumsy with my words. And then if we are planting by seeds, we want to keep in mind that we will need to thin these plants because they'll start to come up, and it's very important to thin them and to give each plant a little bit more space, at least a little bit of space, so that they can actually, get a little elbow room, so to speak, because they're going to be, if they're planted too close, it's going to stunt their growth. They're going to be really, competing for a lot of nutrients and for a lot of water. Okay, now I'm going to talk about companion planting. And after I talk about companion planting and crop rotation, I'll pause again for some more questions. So the idea of companion planting, which I imagine most of you are familiar with this term, is planting plants that can grow together with ease without competing for nutrients, and by also serving some type of a benefit, either repelling pests or inviting beneficials. So there's a couple tricks that these plants can, there's a couple of tricks to companion planting, which means that we're either going to plant plants that like to grow together for the purpose of not competing for nutrients, and or attracting beneficials, and or repelling pests. Okay. And then when we plant plants that don't want to grow together, what happens is that we see, for instance, this first line, asparagus does not like to grow with onions, garlic or potatoes, because they have a tendency to either compete for nutrients, or there could be some type of bacteria, beneficial bacteria around the root zones that actually don't grow well together. And then you will see that the plants are just going to be stunted, and we're not going to see them thrive as we'd like to. And then crop rotation is really important for those of us that grow, especially in containers. And this is really hard for some of us because a lot of us have that one pot in that one sunny spot where we like to grow our tomatoes every single year. Well, over time, if we're planting the same type of plant in that same space year after year, what happens is not only are we depleting nutrients, which will be difficult to put back into that soil, we're actually inviting pests. Pests are really lazy when they have a plant and they can get into that root zone, and that they could overwinter in that soil. And when we're planting that plant again, boy, they wake up from the winter and they're like, food again. So one way to reduce pest problems and to ensure healthy plants, we want to really take advantage of rotating crops, and it doesn't have to be as challenging as it might seem. So for instance, if I'm growing tomatoes in one pot or one raised bed, I'm going to really be very realistic. And at the end of that tomato season, I really just want to cut that plant down and I want to move on. Okay. And I'm going to move on with maybe something like fava beans, or maybe I'm going to work with some leafy greens. Okay. Leafy greens will be perfect for the cool season. And then I'm going to get my chard and my kale, my lettuces, my arugula. And then after I've harvested my leafy greens, and as I'm moving towards the late winter, I'm going to drop in a couple fava bean seeds, so that my fava beans are going to start to grow. And so by the time I get to April, when I'm ready to put my tomatoes in, I'm going to cut those fava beans down at the base, which I'll show a picture in a minute. And now I've got my legumes, my nitrogen fixed bacteria that's on those root zones, ready to feed my tomatoes. Now, I did skip the roots, but you can integrate that in. I would say at least get 3 of these 4 in to your rotation. And then we will have a overall healthier growing conditions for not only your soil, but for your plants. Now, with that said, are there any questions?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any at the moment.
Great. And don't hesitate if a question comes up later, but I do know I usually get questions around companion planting and crop rotation. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about feeding our plants. So because these are plants providing us with food, oftentimes they need food as well. And I am a huge fan of feeding my food crops. Now, truth be told, I will not be feeding as often or as frequent as the containers will recommend. So on these packages, there's always going to be an application recommendation. I typically am these are pictures of dry fertilizer. Dry fertilizer is going to be like ground bits of like meal, looks like maybe ground oats. They're like little, like almost pellety things. But I'm typically using dry fertilizer at time of planting. And for my perennial crops and my fruit trees and vines, I'm going to be scratching this dry fertilizer in about 1 to 2 times a year around that root zone. And organic fertilizers are going to be the most sustainable way to feed our plants. Okay. And something that's really cool to understand is that when we're feeding with organic fertilizers, we're actually feeding the soil microbes, that beneficial bacteria and fungi that we invited in with the compost. Now we're feeding them so that we can increase the health of the soil and increase the health of those microbes, so they can continue to develop that beautiful symbiotic relationship they have with the root zones, to allow the plants to take up nutrients and moisture on an as-need basis. So that's really important. Also, organic fertilizers are going to reduce the nutrients or allow nutrients to be present in the soil over a longer period of time. And it's going to prevent unnatural growth spurts that can attract pests, because pests such as aphids really like the tender new growth of a lot of the food crops that we grow, because they're able to get their piercing mouth parts into the soft, tender new growth to get all those plant sugars. And what we found is that synthetic fertilizers really stimulate a lot of new growth, and they are oftentimes loaded with more pests. And then another thing is that the organic fertilizers will not run off into our local waterways. I will share as a side note that vegetables love alfalfa meal. So I'm a huge fan of adding alfalfa meal in addition to my organic vegetable or all-purpose fertilizer. I will work this into the soil at time of planting or scratch it in 1 or 2 times a year for established plants. It supercharges your plants. It also adds traces of nitrogen and trace minerals to the soil. It improves the tilt of your soil, and it contains a natural fatty acid that really acts as a healthy growth stimulant for the cells. It's a cell growth stimulant, and I don't mean that it's going to be pushing a lot of new growth like I just said we don't want to do. What it is, it bolsters the cells and really makes them healthy and strong, so they'll be less attractive to pests. And then the other superfood that I'm a huge fan of is adding earthworm castings to the soil. So we want to also add this at time of planting or top dressing around our existing root zones. But the earthworm castings are really superfood. It is gold for your plants. It contains an abundance of nutrients and minerals essential to plants, for plants to thrive. It also contains important enzymes and beneficial bacteria and humus that will only encourage healthy new growth and dynamic root and plant structure. And the cool thing about earthworm castings is they contain chitins that will move through the plant that actually act to be very effective on preventing insect pests and inhibit diseases. So earthworm castings are just incredibly awesome for so many reasons. And so for plants that are already growing, the best way to get these fertilizers into the ground is just scratch them into the top inch or so without disturbing the roots around that outer edges of the plant. And then, as I said, I really like to provide my food crops with food through the growing season. And the easy way to do this is by working with organic liquid fertilizers. So super easy to feed your plants during the growing season. Like I said, the labels will say to apply 1 to 2 times a month. I might just apply once a month or kind of when I think about it, but I do like, especially at the beginning of the growth of my food crops, I like to really make sure they're getting all the nutrients they need to provide me with a lot of food. And the way we want to apply these is just super easy. We add them to our watering can according to the label's instructions, add water, and then just water them in. So just to share the difference between organics versus synthetics is that organic fertilizers are going to feed the soil microbiology, increases the soil health, prevents growth spurts. It's a more sustainable way to feed our plants. It won't run off into our local waterways, won't burn the plant. Organics do not burn the plant. They're more economical because we're not needing to use them as often. It's a natural material from plants or animals. It's a renewable and or byproduct from a lot of these farm industries. Whereas synthetic fertilizers just feed the plant. It is not going to have any relationship with the soil other than moving through the soil so it can access the plant's root system. And because of this, we need to feed according to the label's instructions. If that label says to feed every 4 weeks, we have to feed every 4 weeks because that plant is now dependent on this fertilizer. We happen to miss a feeding, that plant is going to become stressed. Stressed plants are going to be more vulnerable to pest problems. Also, synthetic fertilizers act like steroids, stimulating a lot of new growth, which also invites pests. Synthetic fertilizers happen to contain or happen to very often be higher in salts, which over time, salt, as we know, is very detrimental to the soil. And if we're using these fertilizers frequently and we're not watering deeply, then there's going to be a salt buildup in the top couple inches of the soil. And over time, we can start to see a decline in our plants. Synthetic fertilizers can contaminate our waterways. They can burn if we've added too much, and they're manufactured products extracted by a chemical industrial process. So here's an illustration of what I was just sharing. We have organic fertilizers feeding the soil, feeding the microorganisms in that soil to increase the health, much more sustainable and holistic. And then chemical synthetic fertilizers strictly just feed the plants. All right. And then I'd like to share is we don't want to forget about flowers. We want to attract beneficial insects in the form of predators or insects that will parasitize pests. And then we also want to attract our pollinators. We want to attract birds and other garden allies to keep all those pests in balance and also to increase our yields. And we do that by planting a diversity of flowering plants that look like daisies or sunflowers. And I like to plant sunflowers because not only are they great for the pollinators, but then they also provide us seeds that we can eat. I love growing the giant sunflower and getting those seeds at the end of the season. It is really fun. But you got to make sure you get it before the birds, or put a little net over it so the birds can't access it. And another important benefit to attracting pollinators to the garden with a lot of flowering plants is that they will help increase our yields. And what I mean by that is that if we don't have a lot of flowering plants, where a lot of times the pollinators will not see that we have some plants such as zucchini that need to get fertilized or pollinated. So what happens is that is not uncommon to see a zucchini plant rot. It's got enough energy to grow about 4 inches or so, and then it'll just start to rot from its blossom end. And this is due to lack of pollinators. Now, you might have a zucchini plant that's thriving with a lot of fruit, and you might come upon one of these. It's just a flower that a pollinator didn't happen to visit that day. All right, so before we dive into cover crops, I wanted to ask if there were any questions.
Yeah, so we have one raised hand from Valerie. So Valerie, I will unmute you and you can ask your question.
Okay, so my question is, we have dry fertilizer, we have alfalfa meal, we have earthworm castings and fish emulsion. Do you do all of those at one time?
Good question. At time of planting, I'm going to use my dry fertilizer. I'm going to use my alfalfa meal, and I'm going to use my earthworm castings. I'm going to mix it into the soil. I've already added a little compost. Okay, so it's compost, and then I've amended the soil with the compost, and then I add my fertilizers. And I consider alfalfa meal and earthworm castings to also be fertilizer. And it's just my own little recipe. Now you could just do one or all three. And then after my plants have started to grow, I will then use my liquid fertilizer. And it can be, the the fish emulsion or fish and kelp, or, there's a lot of different really good organic liquid fertilizers out there. They all, many of them do have fish in them, but not all of them do. And I'll apply that during the growing season.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so fava beans are one of my most favorite cover crops because they also give me food, and they're very easy to grow, and they grow extremely well throughout the Bay Area and actually California. So what we're going to do is we're going to plant these fava beans, and they can get planted when towards the end of a crop. So like I said, the lettuces my kale, if I know that is coming to an end, maybe about 3 weeks before that crop is really done, I'm going to plant my fava beans. I'm going to let them grow. And the reason why I want them is because they are very rich with these nitrogen fixing bacteria. Their little root zones grow these little nodes of free nitrogen, which are fantastic. And their root systems also expand and help to aerate the soil, and just really are very helpful in improving the structure of our soil. And then once those plants get to the point where they're starting to flower, the flowers, those beautiful little black and white flowers pop open. And now I know it's time for me to cut that plant at the base. And I want to cut it at the base. I do not want to rip it out because I want all that beautiful nitrogen fixed bacteria to stay in place. Okay. So that when I want to plant my tomato plants or my summer squash or whatever the next crop is, I'm going to now plant it off center of all those fava beans so that when the root systems of those, like the tomato or the squash, grow, they're going to be able to weave and net together around those existing fava bean roots and access all that beautiful free nitrogen. All right, now I'm going to talk a little bit about how to water. And I was really happy to see all the different ways that y'all are watering. But the key to this, and I hope my hope for you is that the big takeaway is that root systems grow much deeper than we can imagine. Okay, I know in clay soil it might not go as deep as this chart here, but we really want to encourage deep root systems, because when we have deep root systems, we don't need to water as often because we've got these deep root systems that are able to access water on a much deeper level. Okay, we don't have to worry about shallow root systems that will have to get watered more frequently. And I just want to show that this graph is actually feet, not inches. Okay, so it's pretty exciting to see that beet roots can actually get down to 10 feet, or tomato roots and pepper roots get down about 4 feet. That's pretty exciting. And when we have seeds that are germinating, we're going to, or all plants really, we're going to irrigate and water them differently as they grow. So at the beginning, the seed that's just germinated, this picture on the far left, we really are just probably misting this. We're really just wanting to make sure that the top maybe ½ inch of the soil is moist, okay? But then as it grows, we're going to make sure then that we are watering a little bit more water, more volume of water, so we can get maybe the top inch of soil needs to be moist, but then we're going to we won't need to water as frequent. Okay. And then as the root system grows, we're going to get down about 2 inches, and then maybe we're watering less frequent. Maybe now we're skipping a day, and now we've got root systems that's about 4 inches. And so maybe we're able to skip 2 days. So the point of this is that we really want to grow deep root systems. And when we buy a plant, that root system is typically in the shape of the pot. So when we take it out of the pot, we're going to get back to using that handy dandy tool, score the sides and the bottom, and we're going to plant it. And then we're going to start to water it to start to pull the roots out and down. So remember, roots are only going to go where the water goes, and we always want to water deeply and wide. We will start watering around that root zone, which is the shape of this pot. Okay, but over time, we're going to be bringing the water out around the outer edge of that plant. Okay. And how do we know if we're overwatering or underwatering? Oftentimes, that top of that soil is always going to look dry. And for a lot of us that are hand watering, it's really easy to think that we have watered enough. Okay, I get caught in this myself. It's really important to check. We want to check, and the way we check is we get our fingers out and we just put our fingers in the soil and see, is the soil, has it been sufficiently watered? And before we water again, has that soil significantly dried out? For plants that are established, we want to let that soil dry out anywhere from 3 to 4 inches, okay? So we want to really be mindful, especially if we've got a nice 2-inch layer of mulch. It could be a number of days, much longer than we would imagine, that we would have to water again. And then for those of us that use irrigation systems, anyone that's using the pop-up sprinkler, please take advantage of the rebate that can get you to switch to drip. Drip irrigation is the most effective and efficient way to water. We're saving water because we're able to localize that water and really allow those emitters to get water where we want it to go, around those root zones. And we can set those timers so that the water can go deep. Okay. And when I mean deep, we're looking at 6 to 12 inches, depending on the plant material. And then even though I showed you that graph where the root systems are growing deeper, trust me, that water is going to continue to move through the soil and go deeper. But we want to gauge our water anywhere from 6 to 12 inches. 12 inches is typically for trees and larger shrubs and vines, whereas that 6 inches is going to be our average annual or perennial food crops. Okay. And then with an irrigation controller, the smart controllers are awesome, but they're only going to be as smart as we are. Okay. Or I should say, they're going to perform with the information that we've provided them. So we want to really make sure we're giving them really good, accurate information. And then we can set these clocks to go on early in the morning when the air and the soil temperatures are cool. We can also set these clocks to pulse out the water, setting multiple start times. This is going to allow water to saturate in at a slower rate and prevent runoff, especially if we've got slopes. The best time to water is between 4 and 6 a.m. And for those of us that do not have a smart controller, these are not set it and forget it systems. We definitely want to get out there and adjust according to the season. We want to get out there and inspect our irrigation. We want to check for leaks and any malfunctions. We want to adjust the emitter placement as the plants grow. Remember, we want it to be out around the outer edges of the plant where the roots are expanding out towards. And we want to add or remove emitters as needed. We are going to put a nice 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch on top of the soil. Mulch is what I'm speaking about is a protective layer of organic wood material or rice straw. Rice straw can be found at a feed store. Wood chips can get found at your local landscape supply or garden center in bulk or in a bag. And we're going to put it around our plants and outside of or beyond zone 1 in accordance with CAL FIRE recommendations for those of us that live in fire-prone areas. Why we put mulch on the soil, why is mulch so important, is because soil without that layer of mulch it dries out and becomes hydrophobic. It becomes actually hard like concrete in some cases. And when we add water to it, it won't absorb. It takes a while for it actually to percolate down. But we have that 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch on top that the soil does not become hydrophobic. That crust is not created. That water now can actually penetrate with ease. All right. A layer of mulch is also going to protect our soils, reduce water evaporation rate by at least 20% and up to 70% in some cases. Okay. So if your water district is requiring that we reduce outdoor water usage by 20%, bam, 2 to 3 inches of mulch is going to reduce the watering by at least 20%. But we have to check that soil and make sure that soil has dried out before we water again. We can't just get in the habit of watering the way we did before because the water is not evaporating out because we put this nice layer of mulch on, we won't need to water as frequently. And something else to keep in mind is when we've got that nice 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch around those root zones, protecting the root zones of the plants, we are regulating the temperatures around those root zones. 4 inches down, those temperatures are going to be 10 degrees cooler than the air temperatures, which is really important. We want to protect those roots as much as possible. One thing to keep in mind is we always keep mulch away from any plant stems and from the crown of the plant. And then as plants grow, some plants need support. So we want to stake them before they get too big. We can use stakes or trellises, tomato cages. I use tomato cages for all of my squash, my summer squash and my winter squash. They grow up the trellis to save space. And then also my cucumbers, my tomatoes, my green beans, those all are going to require some type of support. And then because we are in hot areas, our summers, our California summer sun gets very strong. So in some cases, even though we have full sun plants, trust me, they still might need some protection from that sun. So to prevent sun scald or sunburn on our vegetables, we want to set up some shade cloth, 30% to 50%, and I would err more on the 30%, and maybe maximum 40% is ideal for protecting our food crops. And we're going to want to tent that shade cloth so that the air circulation can still move through. And if for any types of fruit trees, we're going to want to paint some type of a protecting a sunburn protection paint or latex paint that is mixed 50-50 with water, that is a light color. It could be pastel, it could be white, it can be anything that's a light color. This is going to prevent sunburn on our young fruit trees. And then a brief note about pests in the garden. Before we close, I just want to briefly talk about pest problems because they are going to show up and we might panic. So we always want to understand why the pest is causing the damage. Okay, so what is that pest and what's going on? You know, are we keeping the area too moist and it's attracting slugs and snails? Are we growing chard and spinach and beets as the temperatures get warmer and that's going to trigger the vegetable leaf miner? Are flea beetles just a natural occurrence? And maybe we can evaluate our thresholds for tolerance because the flea beetles only really damaging the leaves of our tomatoes and not causing any problems to the fruit. Okay. We want to address the cause and really understand what's going on before we react, because sometimes it could be that we don't have mulch on the soil, or because we haven't rotated our crops, or maybe we're not irrigating the plants properly, or maybe because it's a cool season plant that's growing as the temperatures are warming up. Okay. And then if a pesticide is needed, we're always going to choose an eco-friendly product. We're always going to apply according to the label. We're only going to apply the product to the pest. That pesticide is only going to get applied to that pest. We're going to spot apply. We're not going to spray down the whole garden or put products like snail bait or diatomaceous earth in areas that we don't need it. And we're going to avoid applying pesticides to anything that's in flower. And we're always going to apply at dusk, because eco-friendly pesticides, once they are dry, they are not harmful to pollinators, to beneficial insects, to us, to pets, to children. And so when we apply at dusk, our pollinators are less likely going to be active, and it has the entire evening to dry before anyone might enter the area. And then proper pest identification is essential. If we can't identify that pest, it's going to be really hard to manage the problem. And just understand that over 90% of the insects and spiders, all the bugs that we see in the garden are actually beneficial. That's 90%. So we really want to take a pause and really 100% identify what we're looking at. And then also, you know, learn that pest's habitat and learn the timing and understand the life cycle of that pest. And then know its natural enemies and are they present? You know, aphids on a rosebud, we might not recognize the syrphid fly larva of that is a beneficial insect in eating those aphids. So we don't need to go for a pesticide. We just let those natural enemies do the trick. I like to always employ integrated pest management before going to a pesticide, and that's actually identification, identifying that pest, preventing the pest problem, and taking some different action steps, which are bolstering the health of the garden, which we've talked about, employing mechanical controls like traps and barriers and tools. I showed you a couple pictures of that at the beginning of the program, inviting beneficial organisms such as beneficial insects that support the ecosystem. And then of course, always using chemicals, the pesticides, as a last resort when we've exercised all of those other options. Some resources that are going to help you, especially with pest management, and only because pests always show up and it's always a problem. Our Water, Our World is a great resource that has fact sheets that list pests by topic that are really easy to read and very easy to understand. And we partner with, or I should say, Our Water, Our World partners with UCIPM. UCIPM is a wealth of information that really dives deep into a lot of these pest problems and goes into, it's a huge library, a huge database of information that's just an amazing resource for us. Bugguide.net is also awesome because if there's an insect in the garden we can't identify, like I said, it would be really hard to understand what it is or how to manage it if it's a pest. So go to bugguide.net for some pest ID information and support. And then of course, the National Pesticide Information Center is really great. It helps us understand the mode of action of the pesticides we use and any of the unintended risks that we might not be aware of. And then a couple of my favorite gardening books that I highly recommend, regardless of where you live throughout the greater Bay Area, is Pam Pierce's Golden Gate Gardening. It is just a wealth of information. It'll really pair nicely with that Master Gardener's Planting Guide. And then another fun book is the Western Garden, Sunset Western Garden publication of Book of Edibles, which is also really fun. And I just like to thank you for joining us. Hopefully that was helpful and that it really provided you with a lot of good information and inspired you to get out and grow more varieties of fun foods that maybe you had never tried before.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Suzanne. That was so informative. I learned so much. I love it.
Right on, right on.
Yes, so we do have a few last minute questions here. So Valerie has her hand raised. Valerie, the floor is yours.
Okay, I have two questions. One on the mulch. I haven't used mulch in the garden before. So I was wondering what you do, like you have this 2 to 3 layers of mulch and then your plant is done for the season. So you pull these out and do you have to push all the mulch away then to put all the new fertilizer in and all the new everything else? Is that how you manage that?
Yes. So I've got typically with my raised beds or my planting beds, I will use straw. I use rice straw because it's very easy to lift up or to move to the side. But if we're using wood chips, believe it or not, it's also really easy just to rake to the side. And I typically don't pull my plants out. I typically just cut them at the base. I've already put a lot of effort into growing and enhancing the biology in the soil. So I typically don't like to disturb it too much. So I'll just cut at the base. And then I will just move a little bit of mulch to the side, spot amend with some compost, get those fertilizers in there, plant my plant, and then push that mulch up around the sides of the plant. But I always want to give my plants a little bit of room.
Okay.
I never want to put mulch up at the very base of the stem of the plant because that can actually suffocate it. It could cause rot. And it can actually kill the plant. So I always want to give my plants a little room, but that mulch is going to be key. And I'll tell you, I always slightly plant my plants. I just ever so slightly plant them up a little bit. So then when I have mulch, the mulch is going to grade out. And when I'm out at the outer edge of my plant, I have that nice 2 inches that's going to protect that root zone. And I'll tell you, having mulch on top of your soil, your plants are going to grow phenomenally. You're going to see a phenomenal improvement in the health and the yields of your plants.
So when you cut your plants, such as corn and tomatoes, you're just cutting them at the base and leaving all that root system in there. Wouldn't that just be taking up the space for your next set of crops?
No, it's going to aerate that soil. It's going to break down. It's going to decompose. It's going to be food. Okay. Works really great. In fact, my corn, what I noticed just this year, the only thing that was left was the very butt of the plant. So I cut it down at the base, but there was just a little bit left. And I just plucked those out, but they're very small, very small.
My second question has to do with the whitewash. On the container that you showed on the screen, it said organic, but then you said you can use latex paint, which doesn't sound organic to me. So I just wanted clarification about, yes. Yeah.
So latex paint is water-based. And when we're mixing it 50-50 with water, it's going to allow the bark and the trunk of the tree to still breathe. Okay. So you can buy IV Organics is awesome. They embed their whitewash with some essential oils, which makes it protects against some insect damage as well as rodent damage. They have a line of products that you can look. I think Summer Winds and Yamagami's has the IV Organics, but you can look around and see who else might have them. You can also go to their website, but it's a product I think it's worth it. If I've got a lot of fruit trees, I think I like to buy. I like their product. But if you can also just use latex paint if you've got paint lying around, and you just mix it with 50-50 with water, as long as it's a pale color. So it could be light orange, or light, mint green, or light blue.
And it can be indoor or outdoor latex paint?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Valerie.
So this was very informative, and I'm actually part of a garden club in Milpitas, and so we'd
cool.
love to be able to present this again sometime. Is there a plan for a repeat performance, or a repeat, or is this recorded where it could be found again?
Yeah, it is recorded, and it will be on the city of Sunnyvale and Bosqua.
Yeah, so we will send out a link to all attendees with the recorded video link. It should be up in about the next week or so.
Oh,
And
great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And it can also be found on Bosqua's YouTube channel as well.
And will it stay there for a period of time, or does it have a limited life?
Yeah, it will stay there for forever.
Oh, great. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Glad you enjoyed. Thanks, Valerie.
Okay.
All right. Awesome. So we have a few questions here. Let's see. So the first question is, what is microbark versus any other bark mulch?
Microbark is just going to be, it's also going to be fir bark. It's just going to be smaller chips. So they call it microbark because it's smaller. I believe it's 1/4 inch, might even be 1/4 inch to dust, it'd be any sizes that are 1/4 inch or smaller.
Cool. Thank you for that. All right, so the next question is, what is the best way to remove white flies from underside of persimmon tree leaves? It looks like they have their nests on the underside of the leaves.
So persimmons. So typically white flies, they're very common. I guess my one question is it the giant white fly or just the regular white fly? So if that's something you don't mind typing in, just to clarify, the giant white fly literally looks like weird, like a white beard that grows underneath the leaves. It looks really weird, almost like a fungus. But either way, if it's not giant white fly, regular white fly, I have learned that it is typically a sign of overwatering. So first, go and look and make sure you are watering deeply, and especially persimmons are going to want to dry out, and depending on how many years it's been in the soil, how established the root zone is, you really want to make sure that you're letting it dry out a good 3 or 4, maybe even 5 inches before you water again. So that is the first thing. Second, we want to make sure we're not fertilizing with synthetic fertilizers, because synthetic fertilizers are really going to encourage more white flies. And then another thing is you can prune that persimmon, open it up so that there's more air circulation. Okay, so those are 3 things. That's usually the first steps that I inspect when I'm, looking at a plant and seeing like, why is this happening? Okay, typically you can, once you adjust your irrigation and you allow that plant to dry out a little bit more before watering again, you're going to, and you're going to see that the white flies will stop. They will leave. A persimmon, depending on how long it's been established, and depending on the environment that it's in, your personal microclimate environment, you could be getting away with only watering once or twice a month. And really, we're not looking at watering until June, and maybe July, August, September are the real months that we should be irrigating that tree. But if you've had your irrigation on already, it might have been a little too early. Those are just some things to keep in mind. But again, this is just some suggestions because I'm not familiar with your microclimate. And then from there, if you're looking to use a pesticide, you can always use some insecticidal soap to spray underneath those leaves just to kill the nymphs. And you can also hang yellow sticky traps. the white flies will fly into the sticky trap and they'll get stuck. So those are both very low, very non-toxic and low toxic solutions.
Great. Yeah, I've seen those before. Those seem to work pretty well.
Yeah.
So she did say it is the regular white fly. I'm
Yeah.
sure that can be applied to.
Yeah. And you can get more information on the UCIPM website. But again, what I've noticed, and even myself in my own garden, I have a tendency to, I'm watering and I'm watering more frequently and the plants are becoming established, and the plants tell me when they're like, hey, you could back off on the watering because the white flies show up. And once those white flies show up, I'm like, oh, okay, I can back off. I still want to water, I still want to provide a volume of water. I want to provide a lot of water, but I don't need to water as frequently. I can really back off and not water as frequent as I was watering.
Great. Thank you for that. Awesome. So our next question says, I've had really bad luck with seedlings, parsley, yerba buena, turnips. They get eaten to nothing nearly immediately. Whatever it is eats at night. I haven't seen any evidence of snails or slugs. And diatomaceous earth doesn't seem to make a difference. Any ideas what the pest might be?
Yeah, so diatomaceous earth is going to be really helpful. However, what I notice, and from experience, there could be a lot of things out there eating them, but if we're watering a lot, especially the seedlings, right? What happens to really like that moist environment are roly-polies, the sow bugs, and earwigs. And typically it's earwigs and the sow bugs that are just going out and enjoying all our little seedlings at night, no problem. So a couple things I do is I'll take a yogurt container and I start my seedlings actually in the cell packs, their growing environment, to give them a little bit of a head start. And that's one thing you can do. But something else you could do is I take like plastic yogurt containers, like imagine a little plastic yogurt container, and I cut the bottom off. So now I've got like a tube. Okay. And I call it a sleeve. And when I'll sink it in the soil. So the top of like about a third of the yogurt container is in the soil. And now what I have is like a little barrier around my seedling. And you can even put some seeds in there if you want to grow the seeds from start and germinate them in place. And then on the outside of that yogurt container, I'm going to do a band of diatomaceous earth that is about 1/2 inch to 1 inch wide. Okay. However, when diatomaceous earth gets wet from moisture in the evenings, condensation from fog, things like that, it will get gummy and won't be as effective. Okay. But what that little yogurt container is doing, and it can be a deli container or it can be a plastic water bottle that you've cut the top and bottom off. What that's doing is it's making a little barrier to protect the seedlings, and that ring of diatomaceous earth is going to, if anything tries to crawl over it, it'll get on it and it'll dehydrate it. It's a desiccant. Something else you can do is make sure when you do water, you're watering early in the day so that that area can dry out by sundown, because as I shared, roly-polies and earwigs love moist conditions. And if we're watering in the late afternoon, it doesn't have enough time to dry, we'll be actually making an environment more favorable. And then I also, because we have to have a positive identification, because it could be birds, it could be rodents, we don't know. I make earwig traps, and my earwig traps are a deli container from like hummus or salsa. I have the lid. Of course, it's empty, it's clean. I cut some holes in the lid that are about the size of a diameter of a pencil or pen. And I put about 1 inch of water and a tablespoon or 2 of like the liquid from tuna fish can, like fish oil or fish juice or fish sauce, anything that's fishy, just a couple tablespoons. And I put that lid back on. And now I'm going to sink that container so the lid is at the same level as the soil. Okay. Now, what happens is that fishiness is so attractive to the earwigs that they cannot resist it. And they go in, they drop down into those holes and they can't come back out. Now, not only have I been able to positively identify the pest, I'm actually reducing the population. And earwigs have been having a really good year. Last year and this year, I'm not sure why, but there is an abundance of earwigs. I talk to people all the time. So it might be that. But again, we're not 100% sure.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. And Sluggo Plus or Bonides Bug and Slug Killer. These are products that are eco-friendly. They're registered for use around edibles. It's just iron phosphate with spinosad, and it's a bait that they eat, and it's not going to be toxic to the food crops, and it's safe for wildlife.
Nice.
Yeah.
Wow. Creative. I like the yogurt idea. That's awesome. Awesome. Great. Thank you so much for that. So our next question says, Costco has coconut coir.
Yeah.
Is this a good mulch to use on vegetables and gardens?
Sure, it sure is. The coir is going to be really dry at first, but once it's hydrated, it will stay hydrated, or it'll be more effective of locking in the moisture. So when you're breaking it up, if it comes in a brick, you will have to soak it in water to hydrate it so it puffs up, and then you can break it up and use it as a mulch. If it comes in bags, then that's great. You're just going to water the area really well. And then if you've got irrigation, you just let the irrigation do the trick from after the first time you've watered.
Great. Thank you. Great. So our next question says, could you use burlap around the base of a fruit tree as an alternative to whitewash or paint?
Maybe. I'm not 100% about that. I would probably want to tent it so it's a little further out. I wouldn't want it touching. Just because there could be moisture. It could also harbor pests. But if that's the case, I would probably then want to use maybe a shade cloth or maybe row cover. But again, we want to tent it so it's out, so that there's air circulation and it's just really working as a shade and not locking any moisture or heat in. But that's a good question.
Great. Awesome. So the next question is from Jane. She says, are eggshells and rice hay around the plants and garlic spray are good to deter the slugs and snails?
So that's a really great question. I don't know about the garlic spray. I do know that there are some eco-friendly sprays on the market that are for slugs and snails. I believe Kellogg's or Garden and Bloom makes one, and I think Dr. Earth makes one. I think Monterey Garden also makes one, and but rice straw has a tendency to be fairly effective because it's hard for them to crawl over it. Crushed eggshells are also going to be effective because they have a hard time crawling over it. Chunky mulch. So if we're using a mulch, get the chunky one, the one that's about 2 inches to 3 inches in size, not the micro bark, because the chunky mulch will also be a little challenging for them to walk over. But with the slugs and snails, you also want to make sure you found all their hiding places. They can hide under the lip of pots. They can hide under the lip of like a raised bed. If we have like a cap on it, just find all their little hiding spots and just try to, reduce them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. And that kind of segues into this next question, which says, are fresh wood chips from tree cutting services safe to use as mulch? I heard there might be fungal issues.
That's a really good question. So when we're getting fresh chips from an arborist, so let's say we just had a tree that had to get trimmed and we had the arborist on site and they're chipping that wood and we get to keep this free mulch. It's so great. We want to be really mindful not to use it straight away. It actually has to cure a little bit because it can be really hot. And that hot mulch actually can either burn plants or it can rob or stall nitrogen uptake from your plants. Okay. I'm not sure if I really worded that correctly, but then as far as bringing in mulch from an arborist, or I know there's some services like Chip Drop where you get free chips, you can be bringing in something you don't want. So a lot of times you don't have the choice. And I wouldn't be as concerned about fungal pathogens. I mean, yes, you can reach out to your local extension and ask them at the extension office, are there any pathogens that I should be aware of in this area that I might be bringing into my garden? Okay. And then two, you also want to be aware, if you're using a service like that, you probably don't want eucalyptus chips or cedar chips. I mean, there's some types of plant oils that inhibit growth. They're great for walkways or paths or areas where you actually are trying to suppress weeds. But if you're trying to, reduce water evaporation and take advantage of all the reasons why we want to use mulch, some plant materials, some mulch products would not be ideal. So that's why when it comes to mulch, I really stick to just buying it by the bag or getting it from a landscape supply or using rice straw. I don't use my arbor mulch I use for walkways and areas where I'm sheep mulching or other areas around my garden that I would need to protect. Hopefully that makes sense.
Wonderful. Thank you for that explanation. Awesome. So it looks like that is all the questions for tonight. Wonderful. What a great audience. And again, we will be sending out a follow-up email to all attendees with all the links used today and resources and things like that. So thank you so much, Suzanne, for tonight. It was wonderful, wonderful presentation. And thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I really appreciate it. Have a great evening.
Great. Thank you. Bye.